Okay, welcome. Weekly Marks, 3rd of August. We're continuing our look at Fred Moseley and Ben Folks's translation of the economic manuscripts of 1864 to 65 by Marx, also referenced partially as Volume 3 of Capital. And the reason why we're doing this is because this translation is the unedited by Engels version of Volume 3. And there are a couple of insights, I think, that are available that Moseley is pointing out. We're looking at the introductory chapter, and I think there's a lot more here. Not necessarily that it's earth-shaking, but pretty clear that there's a difference between the original manuscript and Engels' editing. So not that there's anything wrong with Engels' editing. It's just that I think you can see that certain directions occurred, with all due respect, because of Engels' editing, even though Engels has given us some incredibly important elements. These differences actually make sense and have shown that certain directions took place in the history of Marxist thought that were not bad wanderings, but at certain occasions we may have all gotten on the wrong track, or at least we should look back at the beginning to see where those subtleties occur. All right, we started yesterday a long ways down here, and a little bit past halfway through. So we're going to try and get there to the halfway mark and continue on. I think the point is, of course, that there was a lot missing from both Volume 2 and Volume 3, but that's not a bad thing. uh, anyway, so hang in there for a second. Chapter 5. Note, of course, that Engels' Part 4 is almost the same as Marx's Chapter 4, and there's perhaps nothing to comment on. So let's start with Chapter 5, since we have almost 30 pages more to go. Chapter 5, the division of profit into interest and profit of enterprise. Industrial or commercial profit, interest-bearing capital, is the longest chapter in Marx's manuscript, 250 pages. This chapter explains interest as part of the total surplus value, with the assumption that the total surplus value is taken as a predetermined given amount, determined by the prior theory of the production of surplus value in books 1 and 2. And this volumes 1 and 2, and this total does not change as a result of its division into profit and interest. Engels said in his preface that Chapter 5 gave him the major difficulty in preparing Marx's manuscript for publication. However, when looked at more closely, it becomes clear that almost all the difficulty was in the last half of Marx's chapter, that is, pages 598 to 692, which became Engels' chapters 30 to 35. And this last half is the least important part of this chapter, consisting in large part of excerpts of parliamentary reports. Yes, that is the significant part of it. The first four sections of Marx's chapter 5, which became Engels' chapters 21 to 24, are about interest-bearing capital and the interest and division of the total surplus into profit and interest, and are the most important sections in this chapter for the main subject of this volume, that is, the distribution of surplus value and the particular forms of capital and surplus value, including interest. These sections are in almost finished form. Engels said basically completed, and Engels made no important changes besides converting sections into chapters. Now, the main conclusion of these four sections is that there is no general law of the determination of the rate of interest, and thus that there is no general law of the division of the total surplus value into profit and interest. Instead, Marx argued, the rate of interest is determined by the accidental relation between the supply and demand for loanable funds on the money market, which vary a lot over the cycle of expansion and contraction. There are no subsections with titles for the first 98 pages of Section 5, that is, credit, fictitious capital of Marx's Chapter 5. There are only three subsections marked with Roman numerals. The MEGA editors, MEGA, added titles to these subsections in the text, but not in the contents page, using Engels' titles of his chapters. Engels converted the first 50 pages of Section 5 of Marx's Chapter 5 into his chapters 25 through 29. And these pages also did not require much editing. That's footnote 62. Chapters 27, the role of credit in capitalist production, and 29, bank capital's component parts, are taken almost directly from Marx's manuscript. Engels did more editing revisions in his chapters 25, that is credit and fictitious capital, 26, the accumulation of money capital, and 28, means of circulation and capital, but there do not appear to be any substantial changes of meaning, with one possible exception in the first sentence of chapter 25 to be discussed below. Engels said in his preface that his main difficulties were with the rest of Section 5, that is, pages 598 to 692. Engels made 6 chapters out of these pages, that is, chapters 30 through 35. There are substantial rearrangements and relocations of the text, but by and large, Engels' edited version follows Marx's manuscript fairly closely. Engels said in his preface that he tried 3 times to make this large part of Section 5 into more coherent chapters, but he finally gave up. And these failed attempts to improve this part of Section 5 are one of the main reasons for the long delay in the publication of Volume 3. This part of Section 5 will be discussed further below. Finally, the last section of Chapter 5, that is Section 6, pre-bourgeois relations, is taken with very few changes by Engels for his Chapter 36. Engels completed in full. Heinrich has argued that Engels' improved organization of Section 5 shifted the emphasis in this chapter from interest-bearing capital, that is Marx's point of view, to credit, Engels' point of view. I tend to agree with Heinrich on this point. It's interesting to see where Moseley agrees with Heinrich. Anyway, that's another story. Engels' improved organization makes Section 5 look more like a theoretical work than a set of research notes, and thus implicitly places more weight on this section. It also gives the misleading impression that all of Section 5 belongs in this book on competition and the distribution of surplus value, but most of it does not belong. See below. Volgraft and Jungnickel have criticized Engels for making a misleading alteration in Section 2 of Section 5 of Marx's manuscript. Engels omitted cursive brackets around the following sentence, which they argue, that is, Volgraft and Jungnickel, which they argue transformed a crutch for thought into a penetrating triviality. Would that we all could do that. So, bracket, where a given whole, such as profit, is to be divided between two people, the first thing that matters is, of course, the size of the whole to be divided. And this, the magnitude of profit, is determined by the average rate of profit, close bracket. Note 66. I argue that this sentence, this is Moseley, I argue that this sentence in brackets is not a crutch for thought nor a penetrating triviality, but is instead an important methodological remark. Marx often put his methodological remarks in brackets. This sentence is related to the fundamental assumption on which the whole of Marx's theory of the distribution of surplus value in the economic manuscripts of 1864 to 65 is based, including Chapter 5 on interest, that the total surplus value, that is, the whole, is determined prior to its division into individual parts, including the division into profit and interest. According to Marx's logical method, the total surplus value, as determined in volumes 1 and 2, is used to determine the general rate of profit, that is, capital R equals capital S over capital C, and then the general rate of profit is used to determine the average profit in each industry. That is, pi sub I equals capital R times capital C sub I. And finally, this average profit is divided into profit of enterprise and interest in every industry. That is, pi I equals pi IE plus INT sub I. Now, this last step is what Marx is talking about in the passage quoted. Pi I, pi sub I, is determined prior to its division into pi sub IE and INT sub I. I'm glad that Engels included this important methodological comment, although he should have left the brackets. The main interpretive issue with respect to Chapter 5 has to do with the long Section 5 on the credit system, Engels's chapters 25 to 35, and the logical relation between the credit system and the rest of Marx's Chapter 5 and Book 3 as a whole. The following is that is, Moseley's interpretation. Let me break here for a second and note that at some moment in the future, we're going to look at, I think, Margaret Campbell's chapter in the commentaries on the analysis of Volume 3 of Capital, where she devotes a chapter to the credit system. Anyway, back to the text. The following is Moseley's interpretation. In April 1858, towards the end of his work on the Grundrisse, Marx wrote the following outline of his book on capital in a letter to Engels, in which credit is the third section after capital in general and competition. That is, this is Marx. Number 1, or Roman numeral 1, capital contains 4 sections. A, capital in general. This is the subject matter of the first part. B, competition, or the action of the many capitals upon one another. C, credit. Here, capital as the general principle confronts the individual capitals. And D, share capital as the most highly developed form, turning into communism together with all its contradictions. I, that is Moseley, argues that this very clear outline remained in the basic logical structure of Marx's theory of capital in all the later drafts of Capital, including the economic manuscript of 1864 to 65. Capital in general has to do primarily with the production of surplus value and the determination of the total amount of surplus value produced in the economy as a whole. And competition has to do primarily with the distribution of surplus value and the division of the predetermined total amount of surplus value into particular forms and individual parts. The Grundrisse is almost entirely about the section on capital in general, except for a few incidental remarks. This is note 68. The economic manuscripts of 1861 to 1863 started out in the section on capital in general, that is a second draft of the theory of production of surplus value, what became parts 2 to 4 of volume 1 of Capital, the book, But Marx's work on this manuscript moved progressively into an initial exploration of the particular forms of surplus value. That is, the average rate of profit, rent, interest, and merchant profit, and the distribution of surplus value, and thus into the section on competition. Footnote 69. And the economic manuscript of 1864 to 65 presented in this volume consists mostly of the section on competition. It develops more fully the theory of the distribution of surplus value begun in the manuscript of 1861 to 63, except for chapters 1 and 3, that is, profit and the falling rate of profit, which belong to the section on capital in general. Now, from this perspective, the interpretive issue is this. Does section 5 of chapter 5 on the credit system belong to the section on competition or to the section on credit? In my view, that is, in Moseley's view, almost all of section 5 belongs to the later section on credit, just as the common name suggests this conclusion. This conclusion is also suggested by the first section of Marx's section 5, quote, "It is outside the scope of our plan to give an analysis of the credit system and the instruments this creates, that is, credit, money, etc." Footnote 72. This statement seems to suggest that section 5 on the credit system does not really belong in this chapter or this manuscript, which is mainly about competition and the distribution of surplus value. Heinrich has noted that Engels added a key word to Marx's first sentence of section 5, which he argues significantly changes its meaning. Before the word analysis, Analyse, Engels added the word eingehende, which has been translated as exhaustive or detailed. Heinrich argues that Engels' added adjective suggests that section 5 on the credit system does belong in this chapter to some extent, but not a complete consideration of the credit system. More details would come later. Engels may have thought that Marx's Engels may have thought that Marx's second sentence justifies his additional adjective. Quote, "Only a few points will be emphasized here which are necessary to characterize the capitalist mode of production in general." Footnote 74. Now, this sentence suggests the possibility that at least part of section 5 on the credit system does belong in this chapter, but only a few points, because these points are necessary to characterize the capitalist mode of production in general. Unfortunately, Marx did not clearly specify which topics discussed in section 5 on the credit system are necessary to characterize the capitalist mode of production in general, and which topics are not necessary and belong instead to the later section on the credit system. In Moseley's view, there were only a few parts of section 5 that could be considered as, quote, "necessary to characterize the capitalist mode of production in general," unquote. Most of section 5 is not necessary in this general sense. The main part that is about such general points is presented in 5 pages early on in section 5, that is, pages 535 to 540, which Engels turned into his chapter 27 with the title, "The Role of Credit in Capitalist Production." There is no such title in Marx's manuscript. The Miga editors added Engels' title to their volume. Moseley thinks that this chapter provides the kind of broad general statements about credit that Marx had in mind by quote, "necessary to characterize capitalism in general," unquote. These pages discuss the following important aspects of the role of credit in capitalism. Number 1, it reduces the cost of circulation, that is, less gold and silver required, and the time of circulation related to chapter 1 of book 3, volume 3. Number 2, it is necessary to bring about the equalization of the profit rate or the movement of this equalization on which the whole of capitalist production depends. This is related to chapter 2 of book 3, volume 3. Number 3, it leads to the development of joint stock companies, which Marx optimistically characterized as the abolition of capitalism within capitalism. And in the most general terms, number 4, it accelerates the development of the productive forces in capitalism and therefore also intensifies the contradictions in capitalism, especially the contradiction of recurring crises. That is, credit is the principal lever of overproduction and excessive speculation. And with crises also uh, the increases the dissolution of capitalism. Footnote 75. These important pages are not marked off in the manuscript in any way and are immediately preceded by 25 pages of excerpts from parliamentary reports on the causes of the economic crisis of 1847, most of which were included by Engels in his chapter 26. Now, this striking juxtaposition of very concrete analysis and broad general theory illustrates the unevenness of Section 5. Let me break here for a moment and say, well, this is sort of, this actually makes a certain kind of interesting sense. But, anyway, we'll get back to that. A second topic, back to the text, a second topic discussed in Section 5 that could be considered necessary to characterize capitalism in general are discussions in Engels's chapter 25 and 29 about the concentration of loanable money capital in the hands of banks, so that bank loans represent in a concrete form the capital of the capitalist class as a whole, as distinguished from individual capitalist borrowers, that is, industrial capitalists or merchant capitalists. We saw above that Marx expressed this same idea in his 1858 outline of the four sections of his theory in his descriptor for section C on credit, that is, capital as the general principle confronts the individual capitals. Marx also expressed the same idea in the Grundrisse, probably written a few weeks or months before the April 1858 letter, that is, bank loans function as capital in general in relation to concrete particular capitals. A third topic that could be considered necessary to characterize capitalism in general is discussions of the quantity of money under the credit system. That is Engels's chapters 28, 33, and 34. The main point of these discussions is that the law of the quantity of money in circulation that Marx derived in chapter 3 of volume 1 still applies. It has been shown in our consideration of simple money circulation that if the velocity of circulation and an economical use of the means of payment are assumed, the quantity of money really circulating is simply determined by the price of the commodities, the prices of the commodities, and the number of transactions. The same law applies to the circulation of notes, right? Banknotes. Footnote 77. This important general statement is relocated by Engels from material corresponding to his chapter 31 to his chapter 33, that is page 655. The next 5 pages in Engels chapter 33 elaborate on the general statement and emphasize that banks do not have the power to increase the quantity of banknotes in circulation beyond what is needed for the circulation of commodities. And these pages are taken from several different places in section 5 of chapter 5. Footnote 78. Engels added the following key sentence at the beginning of a paragraph in these pages without marking it as an insertion. Quote, "It already emerges from this that it is in no way in the power of the note-issuing banks to increase the number of notes in circulation as long as these notes are exchangeable at any time against metal money." Footnote 79. Close quote. Engels marks the rest of this paragraph as his insertion, thus leaving the erroneous impression that this first sentence was written by Marx. This sentence is an accurate statement about Marx's theory that the laws of the quantity of money in circulation also apply to banknotes as long as the banknotes are convertible into gold or silver at legally fixed rates. And it was good for Engels to remind readers of this important institutional context of Marx's theory of the quantity of money. However, he should not have implicitly attributed this sentence to Marx, footnote 80. And the mistake gets compounded further, as you'll see in the footnote. However, all three of these general topics together account for only a small part of the 175 pages of Section 5. Much of Section 5 has to do with various critiques of the classical economists' theories of money and capital and credit, rather than a systematic presentation of Marx's own theory. Most of Marx's discussion of the quantity of money under the credit system mentioned in the previous paragraph occurs in the context of critiques of the classical economists. This is why, we might look at Anwar Sheikh, for example. A brief summary of some of these critiques include, as mentioned above, Engels' chapter 26 consists almost entirely of excerpts from parliamentary reports on the views of the classical economists on the causes of the crisis of 1847, that is pages 324 to 44, footnote 81. Engels' chapter 28 is a critique of Tuke's and especially Fullerton's confusion between money as a means of circulation and money as capital, pages 349 to 60, and Engels' chapters 30 to 32 are mostly about the failure of the classical economists to distinguish between money capital, in the sense of banks' loanable money capital, and real capital invested in productive enterprises. These are pages 364 to 422. The rest of Section 5, that is 422 to 465, consists mostly of more excerpts of statements by economists and bankers from parliamentary reports on the crises of 1847 and 1857, which Marx entitled critically, quote, "The Confusion," unquote, and which Engels converted with considerable editing into his chapters 33, 34, and 35, placing a few quotations in other chapters without including "The Confusion" in the title. Now, in light of all this material on the critique of the classical economists, Moseley thinks that it would be a better title for most of Section 5 would be, quote, "Theories of Money and Capital and Credit," unquote, similar to Marx's earlier Theories of Value and Theories of Money in the Contribution to a Critique of Political Economy book, and his Theories of Surplus Value in the Manuscript of 1861 to 63. Which belong at the ends of chapters or in a later volume, that volume 4 of Capital, the book. Engels remarked that in order to make all this material into more coherent chapters, he would have to go through the whole of the literature in this field, which is perhaps what Marx was planning to do. Marx may have intended at the outset of Section 5 to limit his discussion of the credit system to those topics which are necessary to characterize the capitalist mode of production in general. But in fact, Section 5 goes way beyond such general topics. It is almost entirely about much more concrete topics and Marx's critique of the classical economist theories of money, capital, and credit. Earlier, in Section 2 of Chapter 5, Marx commented that, quote, "short-term fluctuations in the money market fall outside the scope of our discussion," close quote, footnote 83. But there are many pages in Section 5 of Chapter 5 which are about precisely short-term fluctuations in the money market. I think Moseley thinks that the main reason for Marx's diversion into these more concrete aspects of the credit system is that he was especially interested in understanding economic crises in capitalism and the role of credit in crises, as we saw above. And the specific crises of, yes, 1847 and 1857 that he'd experienced. So he read and took notes on the parliamentary reports on these specific crises, even though logically this concrete analysis belongs at a lower level of abstraction and thus to a later volume. In addition, Marx also commented earlier in Section 2 of Chapter 5 that nothing is more amusing than to read these parliamentary reports and that nothing is more amusing than to read these parliamentary reports and the statements of economists and bankers who chatter back and forth without understanding the fundamentals of money and credit in capitalism. Moseley thinks that this was part of what Marx was doing much of Section 5. He was amusing himself criticizing these economists who had no clue. Many of his comments on the economists in this section are humorous or satirical. While working on this section, Marx mentioned in a letter to Engels the utter nonsense in these reports and said that he intended to write a critique of these reports in a later paper, footnote 85. This intention was partially realized in Section 5, even though it's logically out of place in this volume. Perhaps the few general parts of Section 5 mentioned above belong to a kind of transition between the section on competition and the section on the credit system. Marx had suggested such a transition earlier in the manuscript of 1861 to 63 in the following passage, quote, "Credit is both the result and the condition of capitalist production, and this provides a convenient transition from competition between capitals to capital as credit." Close quote, footnote 86. Now, however that may be, Moseley's conclusion is that almost all of Section 5 does not belong to the section on competition, and thus does not belong in Volume 3, Book 3 of Capital. Competition is primarily about the distribution of surplus value, i.e., about the division of the total surplus value into individual parts, including its division into interest and profit. And Section 5 is not about the determination of interest or the rate of interest or the division of the total surplus value into profit and interest. That determination had already been accomplished in the first four sections of Marx's chapter, Engels' chapters 21 to 24, especially Section 2, also Engels' chapter 22. As we have seen in these earlier sections, Marx argued that there's no general law that determines the rate of interest, and thus there's no general law that determines the division of the total surplus value into interest and profit. Instead, the rate of interest is determined by the accidental relation between supply and demand in the loanable funds market. Therefore, there's nothing left to investigate concerning the general laws of the rate of interest and the division of the total surplus value into interest and profit, since there are no such general laws. Most of Section 5 belongs to the later section on the credit system, and some parts of it could perhaps be considered a transition from the section on competition to the section on credit. Heinrich has argued that capital is supposed to be a general abstract theory of capitalism that is applicable to more or less all capitalist economies. Therefore, including all the material about the banking institutions of 19th century England in Engels' Volume 3, gave the impression that the English banking institutions were generalizable to all capitalist economies, footnote 87. That may be true, but Moseley doesn't really think so. But Moseley doesn't think that this was Engels' intention. Engels doesn't think that Engels had this distinction between general and historically specific in mind when he was editing Marx's manuscript. Engels was not trying to decide what material goes in Volume 3 and what material does not. Instead, Engels was trying to figure out the best way to include all the material Marx wrote, and this was difficult because Marx's Section 5 was so uneven and unorganized, period. Engels said in his preface, quote, "In this way, I finally managed to introduce into the text all of the author's statements that were in my way pertinent to, in any way, pertinent to the matter at hand," close quote. Therefore, the ultimate blame for this problem, if there is a problem, should go to Marx, who wrote all this historically specific content in Section 5. But Moseley doesn't think that this is a problem in the first place. It just needs to be recognized that most of this material belongs to the later section on the credit system, and that would be better and logically more correct and consistent to move this more concrete section to the end of the book, or perhaps to another book altogether, as Marx planned. Chapter 6. Page 34. Chapter 6. The transformation of surplus profit into ground rent is another long chapter, but it's more finished than Chapter 5. Marx had already written extensively on this subject in the economic manuscripts of 1861 to 63, footnote 89, so he was able to write a fairly complete chapter in this manuscript, although there were a few incomplete topics to be discussed below. Rent is analyzed in this chapter as a part of the total surplus value that is appropriated by landlords because of their monopoly ownership of the land. As in the previous chapters and the other individual parts of surplus value, the total amount of surplus value is taken as a predetermined given magnitude in the theory of rent. This total amount of surplus value is split into profit and rent does not enter into the equalization of profit rates across industries. Quote, the analysis of landed property in its various historical forms lies outside the scope of the present work. We're concerned with it only insofar as a portion of the surplus value that capital produces falls to the share of the landowner, close quote, footnote 90. Marx divided chapter 6 on rent into 3 sections: A, introduction; B, differential rent; and C, absolute rent. In the manuscript, Marx actually wrote section C, that is pages 737 to 97 of this volume, before section B, pages 798 to page 883, footnote 91. Section C was not subdivided by Marx, but Engels subdivided it into 3 chapters. Chapter 45 on absolute rent, chapter 46, rent of buildings, rent of mines, price of land, and 47, the genesis of capitalist ground rent. The contents of these 3 unmarked subsections in Marx's manuscript that Engels turned into chapters were quite distinct, as Engels' chapter titles suggest. But there were no headings or even extra line spaces in Marx's manuscript to mark those transitions from one topic to another. The long section, that is section B, on differential rent was well structured, but it was also not explicitly divided into subsections. The first implicit subsection is about the quote-unquote first form of differential rent due to unequal fertilities of land. That is, in this volume, it's pages 806 to 823, and the second implicit subsection is about the second form of differential rent. So differential rent 1 and differential rent 2. Differential rent 2 is in this volume, pages 824 to 63. That is the ones due to unequal capital investments, period. The discussions of the second form was in turn subdivided into 3 clearly marked cases with titles, that is, prices of production constant, decreasing prices, and increasing prices. For the last case, there is only a title. And the first 2 cases are in turn subdivided into 3 or 4 variants, if you can follow that: the productivity of the additional capital constant, decreasing, and increasing. The main question throughout this detailed analysis of the second form of differential rent is the following. Quote, what are the effects of additional capital accumulation in agriculture on the amount of surplus profit, footnote 92, produced in agriculture, and thus on the amount of rent and the structure of differential rent across lands of unequal fertility and productivity, question mark. Engels turned this long section into 7 chapters, his chapters 38 to 44. Except for this division into chapters, Engels made very few changes in the content of what Marx wrote. He changed some of the numbers in Marx's tables in order to eliminate fractions and make them clear. The main addition was that Engels wrote the first half of his chapter 43, that is differential rent 2, third case, that is pages 847 to 50 in this volume, because Marx only had a title for this case. Engels's first half of chapter 43 also included a helpful, detailed recapitulation of the 7 variants analyzed by Marx for the first 2 cases, with different and more realistic tables, and the 6 variants for Engels' third case. Engels' main conclusion is that in 10 of the 13 variants he considered, additional capital investment in agriculture resulted in an increase in the total rent of landlords, which explains the amazing vitality of landlords. On the other hand, the other 3 variants of the 13 explain why this vitality is gradually approaching its end due to the more fertile lands in North and South America, Russia, etc., being brought into cultivation, North, South, etc. The rest of Engels' chapter 43 is Marx's own conclusion of his analysis of differential rent 2, footnote 95, which is more theoretical and complicated and is focused on the second variant of the first case. That is, the constant price of production and declining capital productivity. Marx's main conclusion is that the necessity to pay rent creates an artificial barrier for the investment of capital in agriculture, which requires an earlier and more rapid rise in the price of agricultural goods in order thereby to guarantee the increased supply that has become necessary. Footnote 96. Just before this conclusion, Marx inserted the following detailed outline of his chapter on rent, footnote 97. That is, quote, rent should be discussed under the following headings. Capital A1, the concept of differential rent as such, the example of water power, then the transition to agricultural rent proper. Heading capital A2, differential rent 1, arising from the varied fertility of different tracts of land. Capital A3, heading. Differential rent 2, arising from excessive capital investments on the same land. Now, this should be divided further into A, B, and C, and D. A is differential rent with the price of production stationary. B, differential rent with the price of production falling. C, differential rent with the price of production rising. And D, the transformation of surplus profit into rent. Heading A4, the influence of this rent on the rate of profit. Heading B on absolute rent. Heading C, the price of land. And heading D, final considerations on ground rent. Now, we can see that the basic structure of this outline is the same as in Marx's draft that he was working on, in the sense that the differential rent comes before absolute rent, and differential rent is subdivided into first form and second form. And the second form is in turn subdivided into 3 cases. The price of land, a short draft of which was included in the section on the manuscript on absolute rent as mentioned above, is given a section of its own. The remaining topics of this outline, that is D under heading A3, A4, and D, remain to be written. The planned subsection on the transformation of surplus profit into rent, that is heading A3, subsection D, would have been interesting. This topic has to do with the actual historical conditions that determine how much of the surplus profit produced in agriculture by additional capital investment is in fact transferred from capitalist farmers to landlords, which depends on the class conflict between capitalist farmers and landlords. Now, this long discussion of the second form of differential rent in this manuscript assumed that all the surplus profit produced in agriculture was transferred as rent to landlords, without considering the conditions under which the transfer of this surplus profit from capitalists to landlords is actually made, footnote 98. It appears that this final subsection would have discussed these concrete historical conditions. Heading A4, the influence of this rent on the rate of profit, is an important topic, and it is unfortunate that Marx did not write a draft of this section. But we can infer from Marx's theory of surplus value and rent as part of the total surplus value that the effect of rent on the rate of profit would be as follows. The existence of rent means that at least part of the surplus profit produced in agriculture is appropriated by landlords and, as a result, does not enter into equalization of the general profit rate across all industries in the economy. Thus, the general rate of profit that is equalized across industries and that determines prices of production is modified for a second time. It was modified earlier in Chapter 4 to take commercial profit into account. In this second modification, rent appropriated by landlords is subtracted from the gross surplus value in the numerator of the general rate of profit. Now, the precise magnitude of the modified rate of profit depends on how much of the surplus profit produced in agriculture is appropriated by landlords and how much, if any, as a residual, goes into the equalization of the profit rate across industries. Now, if landlords are able to appropriate the whole surplus profit, then differential rent would have a maximum effect on the general rate of profit that is equalized across industries, i.e., it would be reduced by a maximum amount because none of this surplus profit goes through the equalization process. On the other hand, if capitalist farmers are able to keep part of the surplus profit for themselves, then this surplus profit would go to the equalization process, and thus the general rate of profit would be reduced by a smaller amount. In the section on absolute rent, Marx briefly discussed the influence of absolute rent on the rate of profit, and the effect of differential rent is the same. The effect depends on who gets the surplus profit produced in agriculture, capitalists or landlords. In Marx's numerical example in the discussion, he assumes that all the surplus profit is appropriated by landlords and the general rate of profit that can be equalized across industries is reduced from 20% to 15%. So we can see that a fair amount of work remained to be done on Chapter 6, but that the basic structure of the chapter and Marx's theory of absolute and differential rent were clear and mostly settled. Engels's editing certainly made the logical structure of this chapter much more apparent to the reader, but this logical structure was implicit in Marx's manuscript and was made explicit by his outline towards the end of the chapter, which Engels followed. Marx's theory of rent was clearly a significant advance over Ricardo's theory of rent in three important respects. Marx's theory explained the possibility of absolute rent on the basis of the labor theory of value. Number two, his analysis of differential rent was much more detailed and thorough than Ricardo's. And three, his analysis of differential rent did not depend on the ridiculous and arbitrary assumption of declining productivity in agriculture. On his advances over Ricardo's theory of rent, Marx remarked in this manuscript, quote, "From this, we can see the very complicated combinations to which differential rent can always give rise, and particularly when Form 2, differential rent 2, is taken together with differential Form 1, differential rent Form 1. Whereas Ricardo, for instance, deals with the matter quite one-sidedly and in simple terms." It's the end of Chapter 6. Chapter 7. Chapter 7 is another chapter in Marx's manuscript that was close to being publication ready. Marx had written a first draft of much of the material in Chapter 7 in the previous economic manuscript of 1861 to 63, footnote 102. So Chapter 7 in the economic manuscript of 1863 to 65 was a second draft and close to final form. It is at times eloquently written and presents a kind of summary of Marx's theory of the production and distribution of surplus value presented in the 3 volumes of Capital. This chapter, this part, is seldom discussed in the literature, but Moseley thinks it's very important, footnote 103. The main point of Chapter 7, and indeed of Book 3 as a whole, is that all the differential forms of surplus value come from the same source, that is, the surplus labor of workers, and thus that the total amount of surplus value is determined logically prior to the division of this total surplus value into individual parts, i.e., its division into profit, interest, and rent, which also depend on other factors. For example, quote, profit of enterprise plus interest, and rent are but characteristic forms assumed by particular portions of the surplus value in commodities. The size of the surplus value sets a quantitative limit to the parts into which it can be divided. Footnote 104. We thus have an absolute limit for the value component that forms surplus value and can be broken down into profit and ground rent. This is determined by the excess of the unpaid portion of the working day over its paid portion, i.e. by the value component of the total product in which this surplus labor is realized. Footnote 105. Close quote. However, This is not the way it looks to capitalists and economists. Instead, each individual part of surplus value appears to them to have its own source and determinants. And then the total surplus value appears to be determined by adding up these mutually independent individual parts. This distorted, inverted misunderstanding of the relation between this total surplus value and its individual parts was a characteristic feature of what Marx called vulgar economics. Because of its almost complete condition, Engels made very few substantive changes in his Part 7. Marx's manuscript had 5 sections, which Engels turned into chapters. One misleading rearrangement that Engels made has to do with the order of the 3 fragments with which Engels began his Part 7. For complicated reasons that have to do with the fact that Marx actually wrote these fragments while working on Chapter 6, and also unclear pagination by Marx, Engels did not realize that his fragment number 3 was supposed to go at the beginning of Chapter 7. Marx referred in the beginning of Chapter 7 to the page in Chapter 6 and said that the passage should be transferred here, footnote 106, and his fragments number 1, and number 2, were supposed to go 5 pages into the chapter. Engels's mislocation makes it appear as if Marx's manuscript is more disjointed than it was and makes it harder to follow Marx's argument. Engels's fragments 1 and 2, number 1 and number 2, are in their proper location in this volume, pages 888 to 90 to 890, and fragment number 3 remains in Chapter 6 where it was written. The main substantive change in Chapter 7 was a key phrase added by Engels to Marx's text, which comes 5 pages from the end of Section 1. That is the Trinity formula. Engels' insertion is in square brackets in bold type in the second line below. Quote, "We have already demonstrated, in connection with the simplest categories of the capitalist mode of production, bracket, and in commodity production in general, close bracket, the commodity and money, the mystificatory character that transforms the social relations for which the material elements of wealth serve as bearers in the course of production into properties of these things themselves, that is, bracketed commodities, and still more explicitly transforms the relations of production itself into a thing, bracket money." Close quote, footnote 108. Marx's sentence makes it clear that the beginning of his theory in Part 1 of Volume 1 of Capital, the book, is about the capitalist mode of production, the simplest categories of the capitalist mode of production. Engels' insertion suggests that Part 1 is also about commodity production in general. That is, it applies to all commodity-producing societies. Marx's next sentence might provide some justification for Engels' insertion. Quote, "All forms of society participate in this distortion insofar as they involve commodity production and monetary circulation," footnote 109, close quote. This sentence appears to mean that the distortion of perception discussed in Part 1, although derived on the basis of the capitalist mode of production, also applies to all commodity-producing societies, and perhaps this is what Engels meant by his insertion. However, Engels argued elsewhere, including in his preface and his supplement to Volume 3, that Part 1 of Volume 1 applies to simple commodity production as the historical presupposition of capitalism. Footnote 110. And Engels' interpretation has been followed by Kautsky and Meek and others. There's no textual justification for this pre-capitalist simple commodity production interpretation of Part 1, either in this manuscript or elsewhere, footnote 111. This is a big deal, if you haven't noticed. The paragraph just discussed is the beginning of a remarkable 5-page summary of all the distortions of perception of vulgar economics that are caused by capitalist production and that have been discussed in the 3 volumes of Capital. That is, production relations among people appear as exchange relations among things. The productive power of labor appears as the productive power of capital. Surplus value is transformed into profit and appears to come from constant capital as well as variable capital and from circulation as well as production. Surplus value is divided into profit and interest appears to come from money capital by itself, period. Surplus value is further divided into profit and rent appears to come from the fertility of the land. But according to Marx's theory, all these forms of appearance of surplus value come from the same source, and that is the surplus labor of workers, footnote 112. Now, we're finally at the conclusion. We're close to the end here and almost on time. The conclusion for Chapter 1 of Fred Moseley's introduction to the Ben Folks translated and Fred Moseley edited economic manuscripts of 1864 to 65. So this is the conclusion. The main conclusions that Moseley draws from this comparison of Marx's manuscript of 1864 to 1865 and Engels's volume 3 of Capital are the following. Number one, Marx's manuscript was very uneven, with chapters 2, 4, 6, and 7 close to being ready for publication. But chapter 1 and chapter 5, section 5, was still very unfinished and mostly just research notes. Number two, Engels's editing makes Marx's manuscript look much more complete and organized than it actually was, especially chapters 1 and 5. But he mostly did not change the content of what Marx wrote, with a few exceptions as discussed above. Number three, Engels changed the title of Marx's manuscript and left out the key word Gestaltungen, that is, forms, which is the main subject of Marx's manuscript, the particular forms of appearance of capital and surplus value. Number four, Engels left out one of Marx's supplements to chapter 2, which was intended as a transition from chapter 1 to chapter 2, and which clarified the meaning of Marx's key concept of, yes, the organic composition of capital, that variable capital is an index of the quantity of labor employed, but constant capital depends on both the quantity and the price of means of production employed. Number five, Engels left out several paragraphs in Marx's chapter 2 that had to do mainly with unequal turnover times of different capitals, which is a further complication of Marx's theory of prices of production. Number six, Engels left out another key paragraph in chapter 2 that clarified the meaning of cost price in Marx's theory, that cost price is the same in the determination of both values and the determination of prices of production, which implies that Marx did not fail to transform the cost price from values to prices of production in his theory of prices of production. Number seven, Engels' organization of chapter 3, and a key sentence inserted by Engels without marking it as such, left the possibly misleading impression that Marx definitely concluded that the rate of profit would fall in the long run. It's a big deal. Number 8, section 5 of chapter 5 is the part of Marx's manuscript that Engels worked on the most and changed the most. Engels's improved organization makes Marx's section 5 look more like a finished chapter than it actually was. And it also gave the misleading impression, these misleading impressions are important, that all of section 5 on the credit system belongs in this book on competition and the distribution of surplus value, even though most of it does not belong, period. Engels tried hard to organize the disorganized section 5 as best he could, but in Moseley's view, he tried too hard to include all of this section in his volume 3. Much of section 5 was just research notes on parliamentary reports on the economic crises of 1847 and 1857, and other aspects of the financial system in England, interwoven with criticisms of the classical economists. most of this more concrete material does not belong to the subject of competition and the distribution of surplus value, the particular forms, that is, of surplus value, which is the main subject of Book 3. Instead, this more concrete material belongs to the later analysis of the credit system. Now, it would have been better if Engels had separated out this more concrete material on the credit system and relocated it to the end of volume 3, of his volume 3, or perhaps not included it at all and saved it for a later volume. Now, perhaps Engels did not fully understand Marx's logical distinction between competition and the credit system, in which case this option would have not occurred to him. If Engels had not tried to include all this material, his volume 3 could have been published several years earlier. To say that a large part of Marx's manuscript was close to being publication ready does not mean that the theory presented in this manuscript was a complete theory of capitalism and no further work needed to be done. There were, and are, a number of important points that remain to be developed further, which included, number one, obviously Marx felt that more work was needed on the relation between the rate of profit and the rate of surplus value, because Marx returned to this subject in his manuscript of 1875. This is MEGA, M-E-G-A, MEGA Section 2, Volume 14. Number two, a more complete discussion of this theory of prices of production including a clarification of the determination of the cost price in this theory, which has turned out to be the most controversial issue in the century-long debate over the transformation problem, see Passanetti, Carcetti, etc., and also taking into account unequal turnover times across industries, footnote 113. Number three, a more complete theory of the trends and cycles of the rate of profit and their relation to crises, footnote 114. Number four, with respect to commercial capital, a more complete theory of modified prices of production and wholesale prices and retail prices is needed, taking into account the operating costs of commercial capital. That's number four. Number five, the credit system requires much more analysis, and especially the role of the credit system in economic crises. Number six, a more complete theory of credit is needed, which would include the historical conditions that affect the actual transfer of the surplus profit in agriculture into differential rent 2. Now, in spite of this long list of important further tasks that remain to be done, in Moseley's view, the basic logical structure of Marx's theory, that is capital in general, competition, credit system, was settled in Marx's mind and is logically sound. All this remaining work would take place within this basic logical structure and would not involve any fundamental changes in this structure. Muller et al. And Heinrich have argued that Marx encountered difficulties in the economic manuscript of 1861 to 63 in maintaining the logical distinction between capital in general and competition, and that he abandoned this logical structure thereafter, footnote 115. Moseley has argued, to the contrary, that Marx did not encounter these difficulties in the manuscript of 1861 to 63 and did not abandon this logical structure after that, footnote 116. The main aspect of Marx's logical structure of capital in general and competition is the production of surplus value and its distribution, the distribution of surplus value, i.e., the determination of the total surplus value prior to its division into individual parts. Marx definitely did not abandon this fundamental quantitative premise of his theory after 1863, and thus did not abandon the logical structure of capital in general and competition. The logical structure of competition. The main textual evidence to support this conclusion is the manuscript of 1860, the economic manuscripts of 1864 to 65 itself, which we've just reviewed. This manuscript is about the particular forms of surplus value and the individual parts into which the total surplus value is divided, and the quantitative premise for the entire book, this book, is the prior determination of the total surplus value. This quantitative premise is repeated in all the chapters of this manuscript, including in the concluding chapter 7 on revenue, in which Marx's logical structure, that is, the whole of surplus value, is determined prior to its parts, is contrasted with the opposite logical structure of vulgar economics. The parts of surplus value are determined prior to and independent of the whole, and the whole is determined by adding up the parts. Therefore, footnote 117, therefore, it's clear that Marx did not abandon the logical structure of capital in general, that is, the production of surplus value, and competition, that is, the distribution of surplus value, after 1863, footnote 118. Wolfgraf Jungnickel and Heinrich conclude that because of the many changes that Engels made to Marx's manuscript, Engels Volume 3 should not be considered as Volume 3 of Marx's Capital. This is an important point. Footnote 119. I think that this conclusion is too drastic. It seems to miss the point that the main subject of Marx's Volume 3 is the distribution of surplus value and the particular forms of surplus value, and that Marx's theory of the distribution of surplus value is, by and large, faithfully and accurately presented in Engels Volume 3, with a few exceptions that are discussed above. In this most important respect, Engels Volume 3 should be considered Marx's Volume 3, with the caveats noted. However, Moseley agrees with these authors that future research concerning Volume 3 should focus primarily on Marx's manuscript, published here in English for the first time. It is Moseley's hope that the publication of this English translation of Marx's manuscript of 1864 to 65, at long last, will stimulate further research on all the remaining tasks listed above in order to further develop Marx's theory for 21st century capitalism. The basic logical structure is in place. The prior determination of the total surplus value by surplus labor. Our task is to further develop Marx's theory in relation to the incomplete topics outlined above, especially concerning the distribution of surplus value, the credit system, and ultimately economic crises. So I know that that's a lot to take in, but these are worthy topics because, as you can see above, that, you know, there were some detours that got taken along the last 100 or so years regarding this. So that's more important. I've added to this a link to the text itself as available on the internet, Marx's Capital Volume 3, The Process of Capitalist Production as a Whole. Now, you know, note that there are differences, and, you know, you don't have to go at the minutia, but it is, I think, an important thing to consider. So you may look at yesterday's beginning on this section, the introduction to the unedited unedited by Engels version of Capital Volume 3 by Marx. And at least this is the English translation. Of course, I'm sure there are German issues at work, and you need to deal with that as well. Let me note that there are no questions or brickbats, so I will return to the live stream controls, shut off the live stream, and then